Good morning to you all and a very warm welcome to Shabbat at the House. My name is Natalie Kendel and I will be your host for today. In case you're new to our group, the House is a house church. We often get together on Saturdays for what is called Shabbat at the House, during which we celebrate Shabbat together. Coming up, today we will be sharing some music and singing together, and we'll be exploring a remarkable story found in Matthew chapter 5. So that's a bit of what you can expect from your time together with us today. First off, just a few bits of information for you. Please feel free to subscribe to this, our official YouTube channel, where we stream live and upload recordings for you to enjoy in your own time. And we post what events are happening and when on our social media platforms. You can find and give us a follow on Facebook and on Instagram. We are a nonprofit, so we deeply appreciate the support given to us by our patrons on Patreon and those who donate to our PayPal as well. A special thanks today to Shairon Milliard, one of our patrons. Our supporters help us to do everything from research, media creation, music recordings, and so much more. Even when you share our content online, you're helping support us there too. So thank you so much. And most importantly, thank you for being here. Next in our info bits, if you're interested in free audiobooks to listen to, then Read Aloud Corner might be something for you. At Read Aloud Corner, we pick really good books and they are made available as audiobooks on YouTube. For example, in the past, I've read the Chronicles of Narnia series, and we're currently going through the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. Click the link below to discover the full playlist and be alerted to future uploads. Sometimes at the house, we make recommendations, good books, YouTubers, content makers that are worth going out and checking out. Our recommendations today is a song by Andrew Peterson called Be Kind to Yourself. It's well worth having a listen to, and the lyrics are especially poignant. And lastly, for the information bits, regards our story for today. Our story, which you might have seen, is called Turn the Cheek. It draws research from Dr. Walter Wink, a biblical scholar and theologian. And this is a remarkable story, both in relevance and truth. It also comes with a few trigger warnings. These include violence, abuse, racism, and poverty. If these are topics which function as triggers for you, which you'd like to avoid, or if there are younger viewers for whom this would be inappropriate, please take steps to take care of yourself, and perhaps you'd like to sit out the story part of our event today. That's it for the information parts. Let us sing together Joy to the World.
Nature sing and nature Jesus, he rules with truth and grace. By faithfulness he proves the beauty of his righteousness and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love.
Let's jump straight into our story for today as we turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 5. One day, Jesus sees that he is being followed by a large crowd. So he goes up a mountainside and sits down, and all the crowd does the same. And as they sit there together, Jesus begins to teach his followers in an event we today call the Sermon on the Mount. We find this recorded in Matthew chapters 5 to 7. During his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus expands on parts of the law that the hearers sitting around him would be very, very familiar with. He begins each of these expoundings with the words, "You have heard that it was said so and so," and then continues, "But I say to you this and this." In this way, Jesus was saying to his listeners, you've heard these scriptures commonly quoted in the synagogue by the religious leaders, by people in your community, but I say to you, ... Now, the point of this format was not Jesus negating, cancelling out, or standing against the law given in the days of Moses. After all, it was he who gave it. He himself clarifies this early on in chapter 5, verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So Jesus isn't cancelling the Torah on that mountainside, but rather going deeper, bringing true understanding to the words so familiar to the crowd, spoken so long ago, perhaps words that had been misused, misunderstood, misquoted, or were much more profound than most realized. Today we are going to be looking at just such an example. Words spoken by God, words often quoted and used, but words whose meaning has been lost or misused. And the example we'll be studying is found in Matthew chapter 5, beginning from verse 38, where Jesus says, You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other also. This scripture about an eye for an eye, which Jesus is quoting here, can be found referenced in the Torah in Exodus 21, Leviticus 24, Deuteronomy 19, and so on. It was a well-known scripture to his audience, and quoted to mean that when an injustice occurs, the punishment should be fair and match the crime, should be equal like two equal scales. If you take my eye, your eye will be taken too. If you knock out my tooth, your tooth should be knocked out as well. But then Jesus says, But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, just like people in first century Judah would commonly use the saying, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, when talking about how to respond to an injustice which had happened, so we today have come to quote Jesus' expounding words, and it is often shortened to the well-known cliché, turn the other cheek. You've probably heard this before, turn the other cheek, used both in religious and non-religious circles alike. In modern times, these 4 words have functioned as a Christian mantra for how to respond to injustice, mistreatment, or abuse. It has also been used as a convenient excuse for inaction in the face of injustice. A seemingly Bible-backed, God-supported rationalization for being passive and accepting whatever unfair treatment we witness or experience. It's the equivalent of saying, just ignore them, with the naive hope that whatever or whoever it is will just end up going away. When I was younger, I used to wonder about this verse. I used to wonder how Jesus, someone I believed to be a lover of truth and doer of justice, could tell us to just sit back and accept lies and injustice in this way. Just take the hit. Just act like it's acceptable. But is that what Jesus meant? Well, today we are going to take a deep dive into the meaning behind Jesus' teaching. We're going to look at two main ways which, traditionally, Christians throughout history have understood and applied the interpretation of this verse. And then we're going to look with fresh eyes on the actual text and what Jesus was really saying to the crowd that day. Because once we understand the message Jesus spoke on that mountainside, it is incredibly profound, powerful, and relevant for today. So let's begin. The first step is to understand how we arrived at the present day, most common interpretation of Jesus' words, "Do not resist an evil person." And to do that, we have to delve into history. In the majority of Christian history, there are two archetype ways that Christians have been led to interpret and apply this verse, often by their religious or political leaders of the time. And these two main ways can be represented by two hugely influential voices within Western Christianity. The first is Augustine, the second, King James. Let's begin with the first group, represented by Augustine. Augustine lived in the 5th century Roman Empire. He converted to Christianity and became a prominent theologian and philosopher, and finally a bishop. Now he interpreted this text and went on to declare that a Christian must not attempt self-defense. He thought that Jesus saying, "Do not resist an evil person" or an evildoer meant followers of Jesus must not defend themselves against someone who does evil towards them. This became a widespread teaching in much of the Christian world. However, Augustine added, "But if someone is attacking my neighbor, then the commandment to love my neighbor requires me to defend my neighbor by force of arms if necessary." And with that one stroke, Augustine opened the door to the justification of religious wars, the military defense of the Roman Empire, and the use of torture and capital punishment in the name of the Christians' God. Following this historical trajectory, Christians have ever since been justifying wars fought for nothing more than national self-interest. So, that's one interpretation. No to self-defense, but justification of violent defense of what is considered your neighbor, extended to mean religious or national interests. And now let us look at a second archetype represented by the figure of King James, who ruled England from 1603 to 1623. King James wished for a new English Bible translation to be made. He explicitly said that the most used translation up till that point, which was called the Geneva Bible, contained seditious, dangerous, and traitorous messaging. He said the marginalized notes printed in the Geneva Bible included endorsement of the right to disobey a tyrant, and he didn't like that. He didn't want his subjects to rise up against him or to think that it was biblical to do so. And so King James hired Bible translators to create a new Bible version, one still used widely today, the one called the King James Version. And his hired Bible translators knew very well that James didn't want people coming to the conclusion that they had any justified reason to stand against the king or any sovereign's tyranny. King James said the public have to be made to believe that there are two alternatives and only two: fight or flight. And that Jesus wants his followers to not resist, to not fight. Taking this argument, Jesus appears to authorize monarchical absolutism, saying submission is the will of God. Don't fight, only flee, only surrender. And most modern translators, even until today, have meekly followed in that path of translation and interpretation of Matthew 5, verse 39. So there we have it, the most common understandings of Jesus' words when he said, "Do not resist an evil person." On the one hand, Christians have justified the use of violence to defend what they think is their neighbor or what is their right, and on the other hand, it has caused Christian subjects to passively accept whatever tyranny or injustice may be handed down to them by rulers or oppressors. These are the two ways. But what incredibly odd conclusions they are. Let's think about this for a moment. Are we really claiming that the Jesus who came to fight evil, who resisted evil with every fiber of his being, is telling his followers to be passive and accepting of evil, of a thing which is the opposite of who God is and everything he desires for us? And is the Jesus who would rather suffer violence than do violence, is he justifying his followers to harm and murder those who harm and murder? Both these interpretations, both these two ways, make no sense in the larger picture of who Jesus is, everything he taught, what he stood for, and the message of his good news. But today, we are going to be looking at a third way to face injustice in this world, the way of Jesus. Because Jesus, who spoke those words in Matthew 5, was not saying what Augustine claimed, nor what King James claimed. So what then did he mean? Well, let's have a look at the original language. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. The Greek word translated to English as resist is antistenai. Antistenai literally means to stand, stenai, against, anti. But what translators have often overlooked is that antistenai is most often used in the Greek version of the Old Testament as a technical term for warfare. It was a military term. It describes the way opposing armies would march towards each other until their ranks met. Then they would antistenai, take a stand, that is, fight each other on a battlefield using swords and weapons and physically killing each other. And so, in short, Jesus isn't saying, do not resist, do not confront, do not stand against, do not defy or refuse evil. He is saying specifically, do not resist violently, the way an army on a battlefield does. Do not stand against evil using violence. Jesus wasn't commanding his followers to submit to evil, as tyrants and the misinformed have claimed throughout history. He is doing something far more radical, presenting a third choice that isn't passive complacency and that isn't violent. He is commanding his followers to resist, but without violence, not to submit to evil, but to refuse to oppose it on evil's own terms. Because evil responds with violence. And Jesus says, do not let the opponent dictate the methods of your opposition. He is urging his followers to transcend both passivity and violence by finding a third way, one that is at once assertive and yet nonviolent. The correct translation of Matthew 5:39 would be the one still preserved in the earliest renditions of this saying found in the New Testament epistles: do not repay evil for evil. The Scholars Bible Version's translation of 539 does this superbly. Don't react violently against the one who is evil. And if at this point you're still not convinced of this interpretation, or that the text is actually saying this, Jesus then goes on to give 3 examples of this third way to respond in the face of evil. 3 ways his followers can face injustice and hatred in the world. We are now going to look at these 3 examples. So Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other also. So, this is the first example he gives, which we've already read. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, the common understanding of this act is that if someone is violent with you, you are to accept it, and even open yourself up for further physical harm and abuse. How often has this disastrous interpretation been thrown in the face of battered wives and abused children, of slaves and those who are bullied? How often has the message been sent out, this is Jesus' way, this is the way of Jesus' followers, invite abuse. Turn the other cheek so your batterer can simply clobber you again. Just take it, meek and mild. But let's break this down. When you're picturing in your mind this scene of being hit across one side of your face and then turning the other to receive the same treatment, you're probably imagining a blow with the right fist. Such a blow would fall on your left cheek. To hit the right cheek with a fist would require the left hand. Now, there's 2 really important things to understand about the cultural context of this. Firstly, fist fights didn't happen between those highly ranked and those lowly ranked in society. Using one's fists was considered a fair fight between equals. Therefore, the striking mentioned here in the text refers not to an equal fist fight, but to a slap. Secondly, according to Judean culture and ceremonial law, the left hand could be used only for unclean tasks. For example, at Qumran, a Jewish religious community of Jesus' day, to gesture with the left hand meant exclusion from the meeting and penance for 10 days. Jesus lived in a right-handed world where the left hand was only reserved for unclean tasks. Therefore, the one doing the hitting would be using his right hand. And again, as we said, not punching, but slapping. But what did Jesus say? If someone strikes you on the right cheek. Now, how would you slap the other's right cheek with your right hand? The only feasible blow, the only way to do it, is by using a backhanded slap, similar to the backhanded motion in tennis. Now, the backhand slap was not a blow used to create the most injury, but in Jewish mentality, and even in many cultures still today, the backhanded slap is used specifically to insult, humiliate, and degrade. Most importantly, this kind of slap was not administered to someone you considered as your equal, but to someone you saw as inferior to you. Masters backhanded slaves, husbands, wives, parents, children, Romans, Jews, and so on. Now, the whole point of this kind of blow was to force someone who was out of line back into place. It was a physical reminder that I am superior and you are inferior. And with this understanding in mind, let's look around at this scene in Matthew 5. Who is sitting on this mountainside? Who is Jesus' audience when he says, "If anyone strikes you"? These people sitting there listening to him, many are used to being degraded. They are used to masters and Romans, violent men, and humiliation. But Jesus says to them, refuse to accept this message. Refuse to accept the message when someone says to you, I am superior and you are inferior. Refuse this kind of treatment. If they backhand you, turn the other cheek. So then, what happens when the person being hit turns their other cheek? By turning the cheek, the person being hit makes it impossible for the master to use their backhand in slapping them again. The servant's nose is in the way. With this one simple act, the person being slapped is making a statement. He is saying, I am not inferior, we are equals. The hitter is now faced with only two options. Either he must hit by using his left hand, therefore admitting that his act is unclean. Or, instead of backhanding you, he must hit you fairly with his right forehand. And the last thing the master wishes to do is to accept that his servant is equal to himself. By turning the other cheek, this is an act of defiance. It renders the master physically incapable of asserting his dominance in this relationship. Yes, he can have the slave beaten, but he can no longer subdue him with the claim the slave is not an equal person. By turning the cheek, the so-called inferior person is saying, I'm a human being just like you. I refuse to be humiliated any longer. I am your equal. I am a child of God. I won't take it anymore. With this one act, the person being hit takes a stand, and they've done so without landing a single blow. Of course, such defiance is no way to avoid trouble. Meek acceptance is what the master wants, and such cheeky and defiant behavior may call down a flogging or worse. But the point has been made. The powers that be have lost their power in that moment to make a person submit. Imagine how radical what Jesus was suggesting to his listeners actually was. And imagine what would happen if large numbers began behaving in this way. Wives, children, servants, slaves, Roman subjects. You'll have a social revolution on your hands. In that world of honor and shaming, the superior will be rendered impotent to instill shame in a subordinate. Jesus is leading his followers to stop accepting the shame that abusers and violent people try to put on victims. The act of turning the other cheek strips the abuser of his power to dehumanize the victim. As Gandhi taught, the first principle of nonviolent action is that of non-cooperation with everything humiliating. Imagine if this Bible text had been properly taught, had been correctly communicated throughout history to battered wives and slaves and beaten children, that Jesus never in the least intended his followers, his people, to accept shame or dehumanizing passively. On the contrary, to such victims he advises, stand up, defy your masters, assert your humanity, but do this in the most powerful possible way, by not answering the oppressor in kind, by not adopting the oppressor's methods. Instead, find a new way, a third way, that is neither cowardly submission nor violent retribution. And Jesus doesn't stop there. He gives two more examples of how to respond to injustice in this world. Let's read the second one in verse 40. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. Jesus' second example of assertive nonviolence is set in a court of law and has to do with economic oppression. Now, today, if you owe a lot of money to creditors, whether it's a bank or another lender, and you're unable to pay back that loan in the agreed-upon time, you may have your belongings taken from you as a sort of punishment and compensation for the lender. For example, your bank might repossess your house, creditors can come and take your belongings, your furniture, and so on. They can freeze your assets. Similarly, in this scenario Jesus is painting, a creditor is taking a poor man to court over an unpaid loan. Now, in those days, only the poorest of the poor were subjected to such treatment. We find mention of this in Deuteronomy 24, where it states that a creditor can take a poor person's long outer robe, their coat, as a collateral for a loan. But the law also stipulated that the coat has to be returned each evening so that the poor man can have something to sleep in at night to keep him warm and covered. So imagine this. You are so poor and weighed under debt that all you have left are the clothes you're currently wearing. And then even your coat is taken each day. In Jesus' day, indebtedness was a plague in first century Judea. It was a widespread problem. You may even have noticed that quite a few of Jesus' parables are full of debtors struggling to salvage their lives. However, heavy debt was not a natural calamity that had overtaken the incompetent. Rather, it was the direct consequence of Roman imperial policy, specifically Roman tax laws. Emperors taxed the wealthy heavily to fund Roman wars, and the rich naturally sought out ways that they could hide their wealth so as to avoid these high taxations. Land was the best investment, the best place you could invest and hide away part of your wealth. But there was a problem which presented itself to the wealthy in Judea, because land was ancestrally owned. In other words, it was usually passed down over generations within a family, and no Judean peasant would voluntarily relinquish his inherited land. So this was where the rich got tricky. What they did was to raise the interest rates so high, between 25 to 250%, that they could drive landowners into deeper and deeper debt. And this debt, coupled with the high taxes required by Herod Antipas to pay as Roman tribute, created the perfect economic situation for the rich. It allowed them to pry Galilean peasants loose from their land. Now, by the time of Jesus, we see this process already far advanced. You'd have these large estates owned by wealthy but absent landlords. The estates were managed by stewards and worked by tenant farmers, day laborers, and slaves. And you can see this oppressive system of debt was hated and responded to by Jewish revolutionaries later in 66 AD. Their first revolutionary act was to burn the temple treasury where the record of debts was stored. And it is to this larger economic system and situation that Jesus is speaking here. His hearers are the poor, and so he says, if anyone would sue you. His listeners have experienced the financial oppression in their society, created by the greedy rich and the warmongering Romans. They share a hatred for a system that subjects them to humiliation by 1. Stripping them of their lands, 2, taking their belongings, and 3, finally even taking their very coat. Now, what does Jesus say to this injustice? How is this poor man to respond? Well, he says, if someone wants to sue you and take your shirt or your tunic, give them your coat as well. What does that leave you wearing? Well, nothing. This would mean stripping off all your clothing and marching out of the court stark naked. Now, nakedness was taboo in Judaism, and the cultural shame of that nakedness fell less on the naked person than on the person viewing or causing that nakedness. You can see reference of this in Genesis 9:20-27. In other words, by stripping, the debtor has brought shame on the creditor. Imagine the gasps in the crowd at hearing Jesus say this. There stands the creditor, covered with shame, the poor debtor's outer coat in the one hand, his undergarment in the other. The tables have suddenly been turned on the creditor. The debtor had no hope of winning the case. The law was entirely in the creditor's favor. But the poor man has used the system in his favor. He has transcended this attempt to humiliate him, and he has risen above shame. And secondly, by this act, he is making a stunning protest against the system that created his debt in the first place. In essence, he's saying, you want my robe? Here, take everything. Now you've got all I have except my body. Imagine the debtor leaving court naked. His friends and neighbors, aghast, inquire what happened. He explains. They join his growing procession, which now resembles a victory parade of naked people. This right here is guerrilla theater. The entire system by which debtors are oppressed is being publicly unmasked. This isn't about promoting public flashing. It's about those in debt showing how absurd the oppressive financial system really is. And the creditor is not only shamed, but revealed to be not a legitimate moneylender, but someone who is helping reduce an entire social class to landlessness and destitution. And this unmasking is not simply retaliatory. It might offer the creditor a chance to see, perhaps for the first time in his life, what his practices cause, what he's actually doing, and perhaps he might repent. In an oppressive financial system, the powers that be stand on their dignity, while the poor are painted as desperate, less than human, barbaric, and disgusting. But in this scene which Jesus paints, the poor person is refusing to be awed by the rich person's power. The powerless are emboldened to seize the initiative, even where structural change is not immediately possible. The message of Jesus' words is not merely to wait and hope for perfection and justice in the next world. It is a practical, strategic measure for empowering the oppressed poor. Shortly before the fall of political apartheid in South Africa, police descended on a squatters' camp they had long wanted to demolish. They gave the few women there 5 minutes to gather their possessions, and then the bulldozers would level their shacks. The women, apparently sensing the residual puritanical streak in these Afrikaners, stripped naked before the bulldozers. The police turned and fled, and so far as we know, the camp still stands today. Jesus' teaching on nonviolence provides a hint of how to take on the entire system by unmasking its essential cruelty and parodying its pretensions to justice. The poor need no longer be treated as sponges to be squeezed dry by the rich. They can accept the laws as they stand, push them to absurdity, and reveal them for what they have become. They can strip naked, walk out before their fellow Judeans, and leave the creditors and the whole economic corruption they represent stark naked and shameful. And here we arrive at Jesus' third and final example. Verse 41. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This example refers to a fairly common thing which happened to subjects of the Roman Empire. A citizen, any person a Roman soldier passed, could be coerced, forced into labor or compulsory service. We can see an example of this at Jesus' crucifixion in Mark 15:21. As Jesus at one point becomes too weak to carry his own cross to the place of his execution, the Roman soldiers grab a random man from the crowd, a man called Simon of Cyrene. And then Simon is forced to carry Jesus' cross the rest of the way for him. Now, across the vast Roman Empire, the Roman army had to be moved around, depending on where they were needed. The high-ranking Roman officers would buy slaves or donkeys to carry their packs for them from one location to another. These packs weighed often between 27 to 38 kilos, not including the weapons. But that help was reserved for ranking officers. The average soldiers weren't afforded this luxury, but they would depend on civilians they passed. They could grab any random civilian along the road and say, "You, carry my stuff for me." Sometimes whole villages would flee their homes if they knew a Roman legion would be marching past, just to avoid being forced to carry the soldiers' baggage. But there was an important rule in the Roman army. The rule went that a Roman soldier could force someone to carry his stuff for him only for 1 mile, a single mile and no more. This was to avoid the soldiers from becoming lazy and not doing their duty. And so if a civilian was to carry a Roman soldier's pack for more than 1 mile, this would be considered a military infraction, a breaking of military rules. If a Roman high-ranking officer found out that one of his soldiers had been helped for more than 1 mile, the soldier would be punished. Punishments for this offense included possibly being fined, being flogged, being put on food rations. The soldier could be made to camp outside the fort, away from the others. He might be forced to stand outside the officer's tent all day, holding a handful of dirt in his hands, or at best, be issued a reprimand. But whatever the final judgment, the point is that the soldier doesn't know what will happen, only that there will be some sort of punishment. And it is in this context of Roman military occupation that Jesus speaks. He does not counsel violent revolt. He does not say, pull the soldier aside and drive a knife into his ribs. Jesus knows better than anyone the futility of armed insurrection against Roman imperial might. But why carry the soldier's pack a second mile? Does this not go to the opposite extreme, aiding and abetting the enemy? Actually, not at all. Just like in the 2 previous examples, the point here is for the oppressed to recover the initiative and assert their human dignity in a situation that cannot, for the time, be changed. Imagine for a moment the soldier's surprise when, after a mile of carrying his heavy pack, the civilian he's forced then says, "Oh no, let me carry it another mile." Suddenly the Roman soldier begins to ask questions. Why would this person want to do that? What is he up to? Usually people have to be forced to do this, but why is this Jew doing it so cheerfully, and why won't they stop? Is it a provocation? Is he insulting my strength? Being kind? Is he trying to get me disciplined by my superiors? Will this civilian get me in trouble? Suddenly, In a situation which began as forced servitude, the oppressed has once more seized the initiative. The civilian has taken back the power of choice. They have thrown the soldier off balance by depriving him of the predictability of his victim's response. The soldier has likely never dealt with such a problem before, and now the soldier must make a decision for which nothing in his previous experience has prepared him. If he has enjoyed feeling superior, he will not enjoy it today. Imagine a Roman infantryman pleading with a Jew to give back his pack. The humor of this scene may have escaped us, but it could scarcely have been lost on Jesus' hearers. This would have been a wild idea to them, and they must have been delighted at the prospect of bringing such harmless and yet effective discomfort to their oppressors. Jesus wasn't encouraging the Jews to walk a second mile in order to build up merit in heaven, or to appease their oppressors, or to be pious, or to kill the soldier with kindness. He is helping an oppressed people find a way to protest and neutralize a cruel and humiliating practice despised throughout the empire. He is not giving a non-political message, nor telling his followers to just focus on the spiritual things and wait for the next world. No. He is doing something incredibly powerful and real and present. He is formulating a spirituality which can be lived out, practically, in which the people at the bottom of society or under the thumb of imperial power can recover their humanity, can live like children of God in a present awful situation. These are 3 examples Jesus gave of responding to injustice in a third way. Not with violence, not with passive approval. Now, one can easily use Jesus' advice vindictively. That is why we must not separate it from the command to love your enemies. That is integrally woven throughout everything else he says in the Gospels. But it is incredibly important to understand Jesus' message. That message which has for so many centuries been twisted and misused, often in an attempt to force the oppressed to just accept the abuses of the oppressor. Love is not violent and revengeful, but love is also not passive or accepting of things that aren't true or which are hateful. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, gave creative examples of how one might resist injustice in the world. Now, the point of these examples wasn't to say, do these exact things every time. After all, such tactics could seldom be repeated. Within days of these incidents, the powers that be would simply pass new laws to end these actions, like penalizing nakedness in court or flogging someone for carrying a pack more than a mile. So the point was, be creative. Creative and active in your resistance. Improvise new tactics to keep the opponent off balance. To those people whose lifelong pattern has been to cower and cringe before their oppressor, Jesus offers a new way to be brave, to liberate themselves from an enforced mentality of slavery and poor self-worth. And Jesus asserts that this can begin before his kingdom fully ends the reign of all other oppressive regimes. There is no need to wait until Rome is defeated, masters to be removed, peasants to have land, or slavery to be ended. This is the incredibly not easy, incredibly surprising third way. On that mountainside, on that day, Jesus opened the door for people who believe to claim their God-given right to dignity, handing back to them recovered humanity under the unchanged conditions of the old order. Jesus' sense of divine immediacy has social implications. When he says the kingdom of heaven is here, he's not pretending or speaking nonsense. The reign of God is already coming into the world. Wherever Jesus is, he reigns. Wherever his spirit is welcomed, these are his subjects. And his reign comes not as a force, a marching army, a weapon in hand, flooding people with propaganda forced on citizens, but as the yeast slowly causes the dough to rise, and a seed slowly growing up from the dirt where there used to be no life. Jesus' teaching on nonviolence is integral to his announcement of the dawning of the kingdom of God. Think about it. Human history is a pattern that keeps repeating itself again and again and again. The oppressed rise up, overthrow the oppressors, and then in time become themselves oppressors. And so the whole cycle repeats and repeats. But with Jesus' way, nonviolent, active, brave resistance to injustice, he offers his followers a way to resist unjust power without being made over into its likeness, fighting monsters without becoming one. Jesus does not endorse armed revolution, but he gave back to people their dignity, their humanity. He said, "This is your right. I created you." And you, in that secure knowledge, can begin to act from an already recovered dignity and freedom. You are, by God himself, given the authority to begin living as if the reign of God is already arriving. To an oppressed people, Jesus is saying, do not continue to comply to your oppression, but do not react violently to it either. Do not live the lie that you are worthless, and do not mirror your opponent's hate. Rather, step into the third way, a hard way, a way that is neither submission nor assault, flight nor flight, inaction nor overreaction. A way that can begin to change the power equation even now, before the final revolution which Jesus, a risen king, will one day bring to earth. Turn your cheek, thus indicating to the one who backhands you that his attempts to shame you into inferiority have failed. Strip naked and parade out of court, thus taking the momentum of the law and the whole debt economy and flipping them in a burlesque of illegality. Walk a second mile, surprising the occupation troops by placing them in jeopardy with their superiors. In short, take the law and push it to the point of absurdity. Loving confrontation can free both the oppressed from docility and possibly the oppressor from sin. Now, to those in power, Jesus' advice to the powerless may seem ridiculous and inconsequential and even self-destructive. But to those whose lifelong pattern has been to cringe, bow, and scrape before their masters, and who have internalized their role as inferiors, this small step is momentous. It's like black charwomen in South Africa who began calling their employers by their first names. To some, it seems trivial. To those within the system, it is huge. Let us abandon the other two ways that have been so long presented to Christians for hundreds of years as the only two choices: violence or silent acceptance. Instead, let us creatively, actively, defiantly, and bravely follow Jesus into loving resistance in the face of evil and injustice. To conclude this thought, let's sing together Overcome with Love.
Our ankles may not bear the weight of cold and metal chains, but our world is still aflood with man's oppressive hate. And just like in the ages past, we need a different call to not be overcome by hate, but overcome with love. We dub our time as civilized, imagine we've evolved, but history is on a loop, a problem we can't solve. How easy to be swept along the current of our fall, but Christ has made a better way to overcome with love. We can't defeat our hate with hate, nor darkness with the dark, but light can fill the largest cell and free imprisoned hearts. So you who are the light of men, inspire in us now to not be overcome by hate, but overcome with love. And all seem to lose the fight, fall victim to the world. Our King shall have the victory and have the final word. So break the chains that bind our hearts, that we may dare your song. Do not be overcome by hate, but overcome with love. So break the chains that bind our hearts, that we may dare your song. Do not be overcome by hate, but overcome with love. Do not be overcome by hate, but overcome with
Jesus, please help us to follow you into your way of facing injustice, your way of living freely. Give us confidence in the worth that you've given us. No matter what other people may have told us, restore to us again our dignity, our humanity, our rights. Help us to neither be passive nor violent. Set us free from the lies that have often enabled our continued acceptance of abuse in our own lives and that of others. Bring courage to those who have lived in fear, healing to the oppressed, sanctuary to those seeking safety, and the strength to stand with you in defending the marginalized around us. May the beauty of your kingdom grow in the hearts of anyone who wants this, and please bring to an end the suffering and injustice soon. I know you hear the prayers of each person here, the prayers that we might not even be able to say out loud or even put into words, but you hear them and understand them. Please let your healing presence be felt especially loudly by us this coming week. Let it be so. Thank you all so much for spending your precious time with us here at Shabbat at the house today. May the King inspire you to live justly. Shabbat Shalom. See you next time.